All right, well, welcome back. This is the last bit of new material before we get into test two. So we're almost there, or at least almost to the second test. So we're on to the endocrine system, and remember that when we talked about the endocrine system, the thing that you want to associate that with is hormones. So as previously mentioned, the endocrine system is one of two control systems to the body. So the other one is the nervous system. And then obviously there are some key differences between the two. So as we've discussed the nervous system, clearly it interacts directly with the tissues that it wants to activate. So you have a neuron that synapses with another neuron. You have a neuron that synapses with a skeletal muscle tissue or skeletal muscle cell, for example. So there's basically a pretty direct interaction. However, in the case of the endocrine system, endocrine glands dump hormones into blood or lymph. And so what ends up happening then is those chemical messengers circulate throughout the entire body. So there's not quite that direct connection that we see with the nervous system. Another key difference is how much more quickly the nervous system acts. So we talked about that alpha motor neurons can depolarize 80 times per second, or they can send 80 action potentials per second. So we're talking about milliseconds of action here in the case of the nervous system, as opposed to the endocrine system is much slower. Now it can react within a few seconds, but its effects can then string out over the course of several days. Certainly the actions of the endocrine system are much longer lived than the actions of the nervous system. So in terms of the hormones then, so you can see they travel via blood or the lymphatic system. Remember that lymph is the fluid, bringing the fluid back into the central circulation. So we've talked about the lymphatic system when we talked about swelling. So for example, I mentioned previously, if somebody has a sprained ankle and their ankle is all swollen, one of the things that we'll do as part of the treatment is kind of some light massage or some compression. And either way, what you're trying to do is mechanically push that fluid back into the lymphatic system so that eventually it ends up back in the central circulation. So in terms of the types of things that hormones can do, you can see that they affect growth. So in the case of things like testosterone, that's an anabolic hormone, or human growth hormone, both of those are going to cause an increase in tissue, so an increase in bone mass in the case of growth hormone, or skeletal muscle mass in the case of both. They can also affect water balance. So for example, we'll talk about aldosterone, an antidiuretic hormone. So aldosterone is going to play a role in reabsorbing sodium, so plays a role in electrolyte balance, as opposed to antidiuretic hormone causes us to reabsorb more water in the kidneys, so it helps keep our blood pressure up, helps keep us hydrated. And then in terms of cell metabolism, things like thyroid hormone can increase cell metabolism. Basically, you'll burn through your glucose a little bit faster, and that'll cause you to give off heat, and then that can increase your core temperature. So in terms of endocrine glands being scattered throughout the body, we're going to hit on most of them, though not all of them. So we'll talk a lot about the pituitary gland, which is attached to the hypothalamus. So one of the endocrine glands, one of the primary endocrine glands then is in the brain. You've also got the thyroid gland in the neck, the adrenal glands, which sit atop the kidneys, and then you've got the testes and the ovaries, so in the lower abdomen. So clearly then scattered throughout the body, and again, they're going to dump their messengers into the circulation, so the message then circulates the entire body. Now, a key question, though, which we'll return to here in a second, or a key thing to understand is, while those hormones circulate the entire body, they don't have an effect on tissues throughout the body. So tissues have to have the receptor in order for the hormone to produce whatever its effect is. And that said, hormones produce different effects in different tissues. So we'll get to that more here in a second. In terms of the basic chemical structure of hormones, so there are amino acid-based hormones, so protein-based hormones, which are the vast majority of them, and then there are steroid hormones. So an important thing to understand there, and the reason that that's worth knowing, is that affects how the hormone interacts with the cell. So your amino acid-based hormones can't go through the cell membrane. So in order for them to exert an effect on the cell, then there has to be a receptor on the membrane surface, so facing out into that extracellular fluid, in order for that hormone to attach to. And then that hormone, the amino acid-based hormones, will exert their effects through a second messenger system. So basically, once that hormone is received at the surface of the cell, then that kicks off a series of chemical messengers inside of the cell. So things like cyclic AMP is one we won't really get into much detail on, but that's one of the more common intracellular messaging systems. So the amino acid based ones, because they can't cross the cell membrane, then they activate those second messenger systems inside of the cell. So, and then your steroid hormones. So with the steroid hormones, an important thing to understand there is not all steroid hormones are anabolic. So if we say that something is anabolic, what that means is it causes an increase in tissue. So it generates more tissue, I guess, if you will. So for example, if we think of something like testosterone, well, that is an anabolic hormone because that causes an increase in muscle mass. Or if we think about something like human growth hormone, causes increase in bone mass, increase in muscle mass. Both of those are anabolic or have anabolic effects, but not all steroids are anabolic. So not all of them cause growth. So for example, aldosterone there is a hormone that is going to cause us to hang on to sodium in the kidneys, so it affects that electrolyte balance. So it's a steroid because it's synthesized from cholesterol, but it doesn't have any tissue building effects like testosterone does, or like insulin or growth hormone do. So that said, insulin and growth hormone are not steroids, but they do have anabolic effects. So just an important thing to understand is when we talk about steroids, we're talking about the fact that they are synthesized from cholesterol, not necessarily anabolic steroids. So things that produce tissue building. In terms of lipid soluble, so why that matters, steroids can pass through the cell's membrane, and the receptors for those, rather than being on the cell's membrane, are typically in the nucleus. So for example, we'll go with an anabolic steroid, testosterone. So testosterone can pass through the cell's membrane, and the receptors for testosterone are inside of the nuclei of a skeletal muscle cell, for example, and will cause an increase in protein synthesis. So the thing to know then about them is that the receptors, because they're lipid soluble, they don't have to have and again, lipid's fat, because they're lipid soluble, they don't have to have a receptor on the cell's surface. They can actually migrate through the membrane, and then the receptors are inside of the cell. All right, so as mentioned, because hormones are dumped into the circulation or ejected into the circulation, they're going to travel, or all tissues throughout the body that receive circulation, which is almost all of them, receive direct circulation, then those tissues will be exposed to that hormone. But the hormone isn't going to exert an effect if there is no receptor for that. So target cells are ones that have receptors for that particular hormone. So for example, one of the hormones that we'll talk about is glucagon. So glucagon is an antagonist to insulin. So remember that insulin, the thing that we think about it for, or its most prominent effect, is to lower blood glucose. It causes an uptake of blood glucose into skeletal muscle cells and into adipocytes, which are your fat cells. So glucagon is an antagonist to that. It causes the opposite reaction. So what glucagon does is it causes the liver to free up glycogen, so stored sugar inside of the liver, and kick that back out into the bloodstream to keep our blood glucose up. Well, the liver is the organ that has the receptors for that particular hormone, for glucagon. So for example, skeletal muscle cells, as far as I'm aware, don't have any receptors for that because skeletal muscle cells can't kick their glycogen back into the central circulation. So any tissue that doesn't have a receptor for that hormone basically doesn't see the hormone, and so then it can't exert any sort of an effect. And the receptors are fluid in terms of, not in terms of the actual makeup, but they're, I guess, dynamic is a better way of saying that. So we can have more receptors or less receptors, and that depends upon exposure to the hormone, but that also depends upon a number of other systemic factors. So for example, one of the things that we see with exercise, if you take up endurance training in particular, one of the things that we see is you are increasingly sensitive to insulin. Basically, the muscle cells are much more responsive to insulin. They are better at taking glucose from the blood and bringing it into the muscle, because a trained muscle is really good at using glucose to make ATP. It's going to have more capillaries, more mitochondria, so places ultimately that we're going to use the constituents of the breakdown of glucose, we're going to use that in the mitochondria. So trained muscle cells are better at using that glucose and also better at using fat. So a trained muscle cell then is more responsive to insulin. So one of the effects of exercise could be that we see an upregulation, so an increase in the number of receptors for insulin. As opposed to downregulation is a decrease in the number of receptors. So there may be some of that in type 2 diabetes. Effectively, what happens in type 2 diabetes is that somebody's blood sugar stays high essentially all of the time. And so to try to fix that problem, the pancreas keeps releasing insulin more and more and more. And so eventually, the muscle cells and the adipocytes become less responsive to that insulin. Now, there's a couple things that could be going on there. The most likely cause of that is actually a problem with the second messenger system. Basically, that insulin will attach to the receptors on muscle cells, but there's some sort of defect or somewhere it goes awry when the cell tries to allow insulin to exert its effects. So it doesn't actually signal for the translocation, the movement of the transporter that would move glucose into the muscle cell. So it could be a problem with that. Or one of the other potential problems is that there could be some downregulation or decrease in the number of the receptors for insulin. So I mentioned earlier that, again, if there's no receptor for that particular hormone, then it can't exert an effect. And so, again, as always, because history is interesting, you see the athlete there in the lower right, whose name is Marie Jose Martinez Patino. So she was a hurdler from Spain. And to give a little bit of background, so to go way back, one of the things about athletics or about sports for women is that there was always this concern that if women participated in sports at a high level, that it would exert some sort of a masculinizing effect. Essentially, there was this belief that if a woman was really good at sports, she wasn't a true woman. And in part, the belief stems from the idea that when sports are introduced, the basic logic for introducing sports, for example, at the school level, is that sports are supposed to teach values that include things like hard work, sacrifice, ability to tolerate pain, perseverance, those kinds of things. And especially in the 1800s, when you see the rise of school sports, those traits, so again, perseverance, ability to endure pain, those kinds of things, those are traits that are associated with masculinity. And so the idea of promoting sports, especially in the 1800s, was that they would develop masculine traits. Well, so then the other side of that, of course, is if sports develop masculine traits, develop manly traits, that if women participate in sports, it would develop those same things in women. And so basically women would become more manly, and so we can't have that. So there's always this doubt about the femininity of any woman who is really successful at sports. And so as early as the 1936 Olympic Games, you start to see references to women having to undergo some sort of gender verification in order to participate. So for example, there was a U.S. sprinter who won the 100-meter dash at the 1936 Games, and the woman in second place was a Polish runner. And so the Polish officials protested and basically said, we want to verify that she's a woman because we don't think a woman could run that fast. And the American response was, oh, she was checked before the Olympics began. And so there was some sort of sex verification as early as 1936. And it really ramps up during the Cold War and in the 1960s. And so in order to verify that a woman was a woman and thus eligible to compete with the women, in the mid-1960s, the IAAF, the big international track governing organization, starts doing sex verification. And so the first way that they do it is at the 1966 European Championships, and they do the same thing at the 1967 Pan American Games. And so what happens there is that a woman who wants to compete has to walk into this room where 3 doctors are seated behind a desk, and they all have clipboards. Basically, the woman walks in, pulls up her shirt, pulls down her pants. The doctors all look at her external genitalia, confer about whether or not she is indeed a woman, and if they agree that she is, then they will check her off and she's allowed to participate. That got even worse, as horrible as that sounded. That got even worse in in 1966 at the Commonwealth Games, which are held in Jamaica that year. And so in order for women to compete at the Commonwealth Games that year, they had to undergo a gynecological exam. And so the women who competed basically called it a grope in order to participate. So you've got these, what the athletes refer to as nude parades, and you also have gynecological exams, these really demeaning things that women have to go through in order to compete at the international level. And of course, men don't have to undergo the same things. Guys don't have to walk into the room and expose themselves to doctors who agree that this is a man. Men are just allowed to participate. So because of the justifiably bad press that the international sporting organizations receive for doing this, they start doing chromosome testing. And so remember, you've got 46 chromosomes, so you got 23 pairs of them. And of those 23, 22 are autosomal, and then the last one is a sex chromosome. So you can that sex chromosome can either be an X or a Y. So if you are genetically female, if you do a chromosome test, you're referred to as being 46XX, and then as a male, 46XY. So they started doing chromosome testing, and so women would have to get their chromosomes tested, and they would get what was referred to as a sex passport. So once they were verified as genetically female, they would have to keep this with them, that they were 46XX, before they were able to go and compete in international competitions. Now, where Marie re-enters this story is that in 1983, she passed her chromosome test. She was deemed to be genetically a woman. And then in 1985, at the World Track Championships, she forgot her sex passport. And so as a result, she was tested again, but it came up that she was 46XY, which is genetically male. And so what happened there was that she had a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. And so what happens there is that the tissues don't have androgen receptors. So her muscle cells, her satellite cells, which repair the muscles, her fibroblasts, which build collagen, those tissues didn't have receptors that were responsive to testosterone. So even though she was genetically male, and in fact did have testes inside, so her external genitalia would have looked normal, she wasn't responsive to that testosterone that they produced, and so the effect then is that she was, by all appearances, a woman. And so as a result of that genetic test, she was not allowed to participate anymore at the international level as a woman. The problem, of course, there is that if anything, she was at a disadvantage because she wouldn't have been responsive to anabolic steroids. So anabolic steroids mimic the male hormone testosterone. And so she could take all the steroids in the world, but because she lacked the receptors for those, she wouldn't have been responsive to those. So if anything, she's a more honest competitor because she wouldn't have, doping in the early 1980s wouldn't have affected her. Now, she could have taken something like growth hormone, but the most common means of doping at the time was combination anabolic steroids and amphetamines, and so one of the two most common ones wouldn't have worked for her. So because she lacked the receptors, she didn't appear male, and so she didn't get the extra muscle mass that would go along with that. So, and she actually wasn't the only one. There were some other athletes. There was a gold medalist from the 1964 games, a Polish runner, in that case, again, who was, she had to give up her gold medal because of a genetic test. So there's some really tragic history that goes along with the sex testing for female athletes. And it still continues in some form, although it's not chromosome tests anymore. Now it's a certain testosterone level. And so women who are above a certain testosterone level have to decrease their testosterone in order to compete in the female division. And so that came up with Caster Semenya, I believe she's South African, middle distance runner. In that one, I think is still kind of ongoing, on again, off again. But in 2015, the Court of Arbitration for Sport threw out the testosterone requirements. So I don't know where that stands at the moment, but there's some iteration of that sex testing that continues in international sport today. All right, enough history stuff. So let's talk about the things that hormones do. So you can see there they can alter plasma membrane permeability. So they alter the cell's ability to keep certain things out. So for example, epinephrine and norepinephrine are two hormones that are secreted. They're stress hormones, so they're released in response to the fight or flight response. And so we release those at the onset of exercise. And what epinephrine and norepinephrine do, there's a bunch of different effects. Epinephrine causes bronchial dilation, so it opens up your airways. Norepinephrine causes peripheral vasoconstriction, causes your blood vessels to close down. Basically, so you're going to direct more blood into the central circulation. They both increase heart rate. They increase blood pressure. So those hormones then are released at the onset of exercise. But one of the things that they do is when red blood cells are exposed to epinephrine and norepinephrine, it makes them more permeable to chloride. So chloride is a negatively charged ion, and the significance of that, of it being more permeable to chloride, is that the way that we carry carbon dioxide in the blood, carbon dioxide has to pass into the red blood cells and then be transformed into bicarbonate, and we'll get to that more in the respiration chapters. But the gist of it is the hormones that we release in response to the onset of exercise, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, their effect on the red blood cells is to enable us to carry more carbon dioxide, which is good because carbon dioxide is going to be released with energy production, with the breakdown of ATP. So we're more efficiently able to handle the byproducts of ATP breakdown. You could also look at insulin as affecting the plasma membrane permeability of skeletal muscle cells for glucose. Now it's facilitated diffusion, so it has to be a transporter that moves to the muscle cell's membrane to allow glucose in response to exposure to insulin. But because of that insulin exposure, more glucose moves from the blood plasma into the muscle cells. So you could view insulin as doing the same kind of thing. Speaking of insulin, in terms of stimulating the synthesis or activation of enzymes, so remember that enzymes speed up reactions. So one of the things that insulin does is inside of the muscle cell, it causes us to actually break down glucose. So it stimulates a process called glycolysis, which you probably talked about in some of your previous biology classes. But effectively what glycolysis does, it breaks down glucose into a final product, pyruvate, and then potentially into lactate. So insulin stimulates a particular enzyme called phosphofructokinase, or PFK. Insulin stimulates that and thus stimulates glycolysis, or the breakdown of glucose inside of the muscle cells. In terms of stimulating mitosis, mitosis is cell division. So a really, a relevant concept to what we've talked about previously in terms of stimulating mitosis would be human growth hormone. So remember that growth hormone, throughout childhood, when kids hit their growth spurts, we associate those with increases in growth hormone until they reach puberty. At puberty, the growth spurt and the increase in muscle mass and the closure of the growth plates is caused by the sex hormones, is caused by estrogen and testosterone. But prior to that time, the growth spurts are caused by growth hormone. And so one of the things that growth hormone does in kids is it causes the mitosis, causes the splitting, the reproduction of chondrocytes. Remember, think back to the bone chapter where we talked about the epiphyseal or growth plates, and that there was a zone there where there was the proliferation zone. If we proliferate something, we make more of it. And so human growth hormone then stimulates the proliferation of chondrocytes, of cartilage cells, which then eventually, we talked about, they grow and they die, and they sort of form that framework onto which we start to build bone at the growth plate. So human growth hormone is one that stimulates mitosis. Testosterone does that as well for satellite cells. So satellite cells are ones that repair muscle cells in response to damage, whether you actually strain a muscle or in response to damage that results from strength training. So one of the things is that trained muscles have more satellite cells, more repair cells around them. And so one of the reasons for that is that testosterone stimulates more of the production of more of them, stimulates the splitting of them or the mitosis of them. All right, so we talked about negative feedback systems previously. Remember that negative feedback systems, effectively what happens there is that we need to keep certain things within a specific range in order to maintain life. So we're trying to maintain homeostasis here. So the idea is that if your core temperature gets too high, you'll start to sweat, try to bring it back down. Once it's back down, then you stop sweating, right? That's a classic negative feedback system. So hormones basically function in that way. So for example, parathyroid hormone, which is the picture of the far left, the humoral stimulus there. Parathyroid hormone is one that is released from the parathyroid glands in response to low blood calcium. So we have to maintain blood calcium within certain limits. If blood calcium drops too low, then we'll release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone in turn stimulates the action of osteoclasts. Remember that clasts break down bone, and so they will break down bone, release some of that calcium back into the bloodstream. Once our blood calcium returns back within normal limits, then we'll stop secreting parathyroid hormone, which then slows or stops the activity of the osteoclasts and kind of shuts off the whole system. So that's your classic negative feedback loop. So hormones work that way, and all of them that I'm aware of essentially work that way. So things like testosterone, we'll talk about here in a second, but it works on a negative feedback loop just like that. So in terms of things that cause the release of hormones, so you can see humoral factors. Anything humoral is the blood. So changes in blood concentrations of things like calcium. So the parathyroid hormone was a humoral factor. So drop in blood calcium triggers the release of parathyroid hormone. Increase in blood glucose stimulates the release of insulin. Drop in blood glucose stimulates the release of glucagon. So changes in concentrations of different things in the blood will cause the release of hormones to try to adjust that to bring them back within normal limits. The neural stimulus, so that comes from the brain. So the picture there is obviously the spinal cord, and so I'm looking at B where it says neural stimulus, the picture in the middle. So what it's showing there on the bottom, those are your adrenal glands. There's two parts to the adrenal gland. There's the cortex and then there's the medulla. Just like we talked about with the brain and the cerebral hemispheres, that outer layer, that bark, is the cortex. Same idea in the adrenal glands. The outer layer is the cortex, and then the inner layer is the medulla. So, in response to neural input, so again, fight or flight response or the onset of exercise, that anticipation of exercise or that nervous system stimulation will cause the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, which help us regulate our heart rate and our breathing rate during exercise. Some hormones are released by stimulation from the central nervous system. And then a lot of hormones are actually released in response to other hormones. So there's kind of this hormonal cascading action. So for example, all the way there on the right, so the hypothalamus, remember when we talked about the brain, that we discussed the hypothalamus as being responsible for the autonomic nervous system. And the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. So what you're seeing just below the hypothalamus there in the lower right is your pituitary gland. And it has two parts, an anterior and a posterior part. So effectively, the hypothalamus stimulates the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, which then in turn can stimulate the release of other hormones. So for example, the hypothalamus can release gonadotropic releasing hormone. That's what the GnRH stands for. So in response to low testosterone levels, or in response to like a training stimulus, if you go lift weights, you'll see an increase in testosterone concentrations in the plasma after a heavy bout of strength training. So in response to that stimulus, the hypothalamus will release gonadotropic releasing hormone, which then causes the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. That's what the LH stands for there, is luteinizing hormone. And then luteinizing hormone, again, dumped into the circulation. When that hormone reaches the testicles, it'll cause them to produce or increase the production of testosterone. So testosterone is produced in response to luteinizing hormone. So it's a hormone in response to a hormone, and luteinizing hormone in turn was produced because of, released is a better way of saying that. Luteinizing hormone was released in response to gonadotropic releasing hormones. You've got this cascade of GnRH causes the release of luteinizing hormone, causes the production of testosterone. So there's this cascade of one hormone causing the release or production of another. Speaking of the hypothalamus, so what you're looking at here, so you've seen this picture before. Let me pull up my arrow. Now you can see my pointer. So we talked about the cerebral hemispheres. Obviously, those are up here. You've got the thalamus here. Remember, that's the relay station in the brain. And then we've got the hypothalamus down here. So this dark purple or royal purple, that is our hypothalamus. And then we've got our pituitary gland down here. So what we're going to be discussing for the next couple minutes is the hypothalamus here, and then the pituitary gland that it's attached to. So the hypothalamus is going to cause the release of at least 8 different hormones. So you can see there has 2 major lobes. So there's the posterior pituitary. Click to the next slide. There we go. So again, what you're looking at here, I'll pull up my pointer. So again, you can see here, this is the hypothalamus. This is the posterior pituitary that we're talking about right now, and then we'll talk about the anterior here in a second. So in terms of the arrangement of the pituitary gland, so the posterior pituitary is effectively an outgrowth of the hypothalamus, so it's still nervous tissue, as opposed to the anterior pituitary from a developmental standpoint actually grows as part of the sinuses effectively. So because it's an outgrowth of the pituitary tissue, the posterior, because it's an outgrowth of the hypothalamic tissue, the posterior pituitary maintains connection via neurons to the hypothalamus. And so the posterior pituitary is going to release 2 hormones. Those 2 hormones are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And so what you can see there, remember we talked about axonal transport, and that's what's going to happen here. So you've got these neurons that their cell bodies sit inside of the hypothalamus, and then inside of those cell bodies, they're going to manufacture those 2 hormones. So they're going to manufacture oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and then we're going to transport those hormones down the axons all the way down here, and then they'll sit in the axon terminals until that neuron depolarizes or sends an action potential. When that neuron sends an action potential, you'll then get the release of those hormones, which are then picked up by this plexus of blood vessels here, and then drop into the circulation to have their effects systemically. So oxytocin is a hormone that is sometimes referred to as the love hormone, because it's one that it shows up in higher concentrations in the plasma whenever we are engaging affectionately with our significant other. You see higher concentrations of oxytocin there. You also see oxytocin released in higher concentrations after childbirth. So in the case of women, oxytocin does a couple different things. So the first is that it stimulates uterine contraction, so it actually causes childbirth, plays a key role there. But it also is the hormonal trigger for milk ejection. But after the baby's born, both male and female, so both the parents, tend to have higher concentrations of oxytocin in the blood, and so it's theorized then that is what helps form that bond between parent and child, helps increase the affection between or of the parents for the child. So oxytocin, then commonly known as the love hormone. The other one, though, antidiuretic hormone, much more important for exercise. So you have osmoreceptors inside of the hypothalamus, so they monitor the osmolality of the blood, they monitor the concentration of the blood. So when you get dehydrated, remember that the plasma volume of the blood is going to drop. Your red blood cells and most of the other things in the blood stay in the same basic number, and so the blood becomes relatively more concentrated because of a decrease in fluid volume, because of a decrease in plasma volume. And so if you become dehydrated, or if the blood gets too concentrated, the response from the hypothalamus then is to release antidiuretic hormone. So again, those neurons are going to fire because they synapse with those osmoreceptors. So the neurons in the picture are going to fire. When they do that, that depolarization stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone, which then drops into the circulation. Then it circulates throughout the body, and then the effect of antidiuretic hormone in the kidneys is to cause the reabsorption of more water in those kidney tubules. So basically, when you release antidiuretic hormone, it causes you to hang on to more of the water than you have, and it decreases urine production. So in the absence of antidiuretic hormone, we get lots of urine production. So you see antidiuretic hormone suppressed if you drink lots and lots of water, tend to get lots of urine production, and so with that suppresses antidiuretic hormone. What also suppresses antidiuretic hormone is alcohol consumption. So as you're probably aware, if you consume a decent amount of alcohol. So alcohol is a diuretic, so it causes urine production. So basically the way it does that is it suppresses the production of antidiuretic hormone, causes you to dump lots and lots of water, causes you to have a high amount of urine production, and so then the effect is to dehydrate you. And so of course that then is one of the things that plays a role in you not feeling so great potentially the next day. Click over to the next slide. There we go. All right, so let's talk about the anterior pituitary. So there's a little bit different arrangement here between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So there's not a direct neuron connection there. So what you'll see, so you've got the neurons from the hypothalamus, they effectively end at the base of the hypothalamus, but there is this special plexus of capillaries, and so when these neurons release most of these are releasing hormones, so they trigger, those hormones cause the release of another hormone. So they're tropic hormones. They cause the release of another hormone. So for example, you can see GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. So when this neuron fires, so when it sends an action potential, it'll stimulate then the release of growth hormone releasing hormone, for example. And then that will be dropped into this capillary plexus, which then goes down through these portal veins and then stimulates the production and release of growth hormone down here, and then growth hormone is dumped into the secondary capillary plexus, which then goes out to the body and then exerts its effect on the tissue. So there's not a direct neuron connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary like we see with the posterior. There's a small circulatory intermediary, which is this primary plexus and then these portal veins that trigger the release of those hormones. And so you can see from the pituitary gland, so this is growth hormone releasing hormone, this one is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. We talked about gonadotropin releasing hormone, and most of the rest of these we're probably not going to talk about. But these down here in the lower left, those are the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So you've got growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, we'll talk about that one in a second, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone that we've already talked about, and then prolactin. So speaking of the hormones of the pituitary gland, so you can see the two from the anterior pituitary there, from the posterior pituitary, so there's our oxytocin, there's our antidiuretic hormone, and then from the anterior pituitary, there are a few, again, there's 6 of them, but there are a few that I think are worth pointing out a little bit more than the others. So as not to neglect any of these, so you can see here we've flipped sides, so the anterior pituitary is now on the right side of the frame rather than being on the left. But you can see the hormones then released from that anterior pituitary. So you've got prolactin, which then is one that stimulates milk production, and we're not really sure what the role of that particular hormone in males is, but at least in females, in nursing females, it causes the production of milk. So the gonadotropic hormones that you see there, FSH and LH, so again, that's follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So they're gonadotropins because they regulate the function of the ovaries and the testes. And so you can see there what they do. So they, in particular, follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the production of sperm or eggs, as opposed to luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate ovulation in women, and then testosterone production in men, as we've already talked about. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, so on my slide there near the bottom it says it's a tropic hormone, and again, a tropic hormone is one that causes the release of other hormones. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH for short, is going to cause the release of cortisol and aldosterone. So cortisol we'll talk about, but it's a stress hormone, and then aldosterone is one that helps us hang on to sodium, so basically keeps our blood pressure up. So ACTH stimulates the production of those. You can see there, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the release of thyroid hormone. We'll talk about that one here in a second. And then growth hormone, one of the more interesting ones. So growth hormone, one of the things that it does is causes the liver, but also skeletal muscle cells and bones to produce insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. And so insulin-like growth factors, in the case of skeletal muscle cells and bones, cause local effects, but the IGFs produced by the liver act more like hormones, where they're dumped into the circulation and then have effects on a variety of tissues. So in the case of growth hormone, it has a combination of direct effects and indirect effects. So whenever growth hormone is released, it causes the mobilization of fat from subcutaneous fat storage, increases plasma-free fatty acids, and then that conserves glycogen in the muscles. It also mobilizes liver glycogen, so it increases blood sugar, and then it increases amino acid or protein uptake by cells, and also increases protein synthesis. And then, as mentioned, it's going to cause the release or production and release of insulin-like growth factors. And then because of those, we're going to increase the uptake of nutrients, so things like amino acids, again, from the plasma, increase protein production, increase formation of collagen, and then increase the deposition of the bone matrix. So you'll lay down additional bone, and then you're going to, of course, as part of that process, lay down additional collagen first. So from a performance enhancing standpoint, growth hormone is one that tends to be of interest for people. So growth hormone first isolated in 1956, and then prior to it being synthesized in the lab in 1987, all of the growth hormone out there had to come from cadavers. But despite that, because of that, it was fairly expensive, and then the price dropped some after 1987. But despite that, it had made its way into athletic use certainly by the early 1980s. So there was a really influential book in the powerlifting community called the Underground Steroid Handbook. And so in that book, the author claimed, and his name was Dan Duquesne, he claimed that a user of human growth hormone could expect to gain 30 or 40 pounds of muscle in 10 weeks, which is pretty fantastic in terms of, and I mean that fantastic from the standpoint of being amazing. Like, that's a ton of muscle in a relatively short period of time. And some studies on growth hormone have shown that over the course of just 4 weeks of use, you could see an increase in lean mass by as much as 5% and a decrease in body fat of 6%. So if you are, average male who is 15-16% fat, take growth hormone, and then after a month, again, in some studies, you drop your body fat to 9 or 10%, that's pretty well elite athlete level. So it can produce a pretty significant change in body composition. So it'll cause an increase in, again, lean mass and a decrease in fat mass. And that combination of things, the fact that you can do both things at once, increase lean mass and decrease fat mass, is one of the reasons that athletes from a variety of sports have used it. So, for example, there's a big doping scandal in the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul. There's a really famous picture of Ben Johnson, who set the world record and won the 100-meter dash at the 1988 Games, and he was using anabolic steroids. He ends up turning up positive for anabolic steroids, but in addition to that, also said that he was using human growth hormone, and several other athletes during those games admitted to using human growth hormone to enhance their performance. And indeed, in that Underground Steroid Handbook text from 1982, Duquesne claimed that human growth hormone was already widely used by powerlifters at that time, and speculated that it would be the drug of choice for athletes from a variety of strength sports. But it's not only strength sports that would benefit from this, because if you can increase lean mass and decrease fat mass simultaneously, if you're an endurance athlete, that increases your strength to weight ratio. So athletes from the Tour de France have been caught using human growth hormone for that reason. And there are some studies showing that it increases aerobic capacity by 10% over the course of only a few weeks. Others, from a strength standpoint, will add somewhere around 10 pounds to your bench press within a week in that case. So it can produce some pretty significant effects for performance, which is why some athletes have used it. But of course, there are side effects to it. It's not just all positives. And so having said that, get my slide to click. There we go. So one of the most famous admitted users of growth hormone is Barry Bonds. And so you can see the Barry Bonds early in his career on the left, and then later in his career on the right. So the first time I showed this picture in class, I asked, do you notice any differences between the two pictures? And so obviously there's a pretty significant difference in muscularity. He's not unmuscular on the left, but certainly on the right he's quite a bit bigger. But in addition to that, somebody in the back said his dome, because his head is clearly different. And so one of the things with growth hormone is that the primary targets of growth hormone are skeletal muscle tissue and then also the bones. But it has effects on tissues throughout the body. So it'll cause additional bone mass growth when you shouldn't be laying down additional bone mass. So it'll cause a change in, for example, the brow ridge. It'll cause a change in the lower jaw, and obviously increase bone density throughout the body. So it can cause a change in facial features, is one of the things that it's noted for. Because it increases blood glucose, also makes you more susceptible to diabetes, is one of the other negative effects of human growth hormone. And then another one, and this one's a little bit more speculative, but in the bodybuilding world, one of the things that they talk about is this concept of a muscle gut. And so you see these two bodybuilders here. Both of them are obviously really, really lean. Their body fat is certainly well under 10% and probably quite a bit lower than that. But you can see, so this guy has what we would call a turtle shell. You can see there. So he's obviously very lean because you can see all of the separations there in his rectus abdominis musculature. But while he's relaxed, you see that sort of outward bulge there, that muscle gut that people refer to. And so one of the more speculative things in the bodybuilding world is that a cause of the muscle gut is not just the increased thickness of the abdominal wall, but also an increase in the size of the intestines. So basically, because growth hormone has receptors throughout the body and causes all tissues generally to grow some, again, the effects are more pronounced in skeletal muscle and in bone, but it causes all tissues to grow some. The thought is that you see an enlargement of the intestines, an enlargement of the abdominal, the contents of the abdominal cavity, and so then that's what produces that muscle gut type appearance. I tried to find some research because obviously I've had time in the last several days to do that. I couldn't find any scientific research validating that. It was all pretty speculative. But while we're speculating, another speculation was that part of the reason for that appearance is that a lot of the bodybuilders who are using growth hormone are also using insulin. And so one of the things with that supplemental insulin, you can see an increase in visceral fat, so the fat around the organs. So it may not necessarily be, or may not only be enlargement of the organs themselves, but may also be due to increased visceral fat stores, even if your subcutaneous fat stores are dropping. And again, both of those are speculative, but certainly that is something that is talked about, if you Google it, quite a bit in the bodybuilding world. So that may be an adverse effect of growth hormone. All right, so I'm not going to talk too much about the thyroid gland, other than it's in the neck and it releases thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone does three key things. So you can see there, the first one is that it increases basal metabolic rate, and remember that that's the amount of calories that you burn just sitting around. So one of the ways that it does that is it turns on the genes for glucose oxidation, so glucose sugar breakdown, which then increases heat production. So then a possible way of doing that, effectively one of the things that thyroid hormone can do is to cause you to burn energy, to break down carbohydrates in particular, but not actually make ATP from those carbohydrates. So inside of the mitochondria, and we'll talk about this more with chapter 24, but inside of the mitochondria, we make our ATP aerobically, and we've mentioned this a little bit previously. And so effectively what you do is you set up this hydrogen gradient where you've got hydrogen between the outer and the inner membrane of the mitochondria. When we allow that hydrogen to move back inside of the inner membrane, that then causes the production of one molecule of ATP. So one of the things that we can do, though, is we can allow hydrogen to move back inside of that inner matrix without producing ATP, and that's called mitochondrial uncoupling. And so basically what happens is you break down the carbohydrate, but you don't actually get any energy from it. And so that's good, because if you don't have a ton of ATP, then your energy stores are relatively low. Basically you're burning calories, but they're not going toward any actual production of energy. And so that can then, you're effectively burning fuel, and it helps keep you a little bit leaner. Is one of the things that thyroid hormone can do. So if you have production of lots and lots of thyroid hormone, you tend to have smaller, leaner people, and then their temperature tends to be a little bit higher. So that's one of the things that thyroid hormone does. and you can see that regulates growth and development. So thyroid hormone acts with growth hormone to determine kind of where the effects of growth happen. So it plays an important role in both skeletal and nervous system development. And then the last thing there is that it helps maintain blood pressure. So thyroid hormone increases the number of receptors in smooth muscle cells around blood vessels for epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so both of those two hormones then cause constriction of smooth muscle, which then increases blood pressure. So thyroid hormone plays a role in vasoconstriction, vasodilation, helps us maintain blood pressure in that way. All right, so then on to the adrenal gland. So as mentioned a few minutes ago, the adrenal gland, so there's the adrenal cortex, which is the outer or more superficial part of it, and then there's the adrenal medulla. So in terms of the cortex is going to produce two hormones. You can see aldosterone there, which is going to increase sodium absorption in the kidneys. And so aldosterone, again, released in response to dehydration, because if you hang on to more sodium, well, water follows sodium, so the more sodium that you can hang on to, the more water that you're going to retain. So it can kind of work synergistically to some extent with antidiuretic hormone. Cortisol, on the other hand, so you can see the release of aldosterone with exercise, and the same thing, you're going to see the release of cortisol with exercise. So again, cortisol is a stress hormone. So we're going to release that during the onset of exercise. So if you're, as part of the fight or flight response, in addition to releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, you're going to release cortisol from the adrenal cortex. And so you can see some of the things that cortisol does there. So it's going to cause the increase of blood glucose, because again, the body thinks that we're having to run from something. So we're scared, we're frightened, we got to run right now. And so because we have to undertake some vigorous physical activity very soon, then the result is that we need to have fuel for that. So we're going to see increased blood glucose. It also increases blood levels of fatty acids, so it's going to cause lipolysis or fat breakdown, and then increased blood levels of amino acids. In addition to that, it's also going to cause gluconeogenesis. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down protein in the muscles, and we're going to use those protein skeletons, we're going to use those amino acids to make more glucose. So the result is, with cortisol, you're basically trying to free up as much energy as possible. So you are breaking down glycogen in the liver, you're breaking down muscle cells, and then you're using the amino acids from those muscle cells, you're converting them in the liver to more sugar, and so that we have the fuel that we need in order to escape whatever thing it is that we're running from. You can also see there that it causes vasoconstriction, so it causes your blood vessels to close down some, which you'll also see with epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then on the bottom, so you can see decreased bone and cartilage formation, because effectively the body's understanding of this scare, if you will, this fight or flight response, is that I need to get away from something right now, and I can worry about building bone later, I can worry about building cartilage later. I'm breaking down muscle right now because I need to get away from whatever danger it is that's out there. So from a more practical standpoint, any number of infomercials talk about cortisol, but sometimes you see workout advice that you shouldn't lift for more than an hour because of cortisol production. And so the thought is that if you have these really prolonged exercise stressors, that you're going to have increased cortisol production. And so with that, you're probably going to get more muscle breakdown. And so the rationale there is that you're essentially self-sabotaging if you work out too long. So that's some of the thought behind that. Then if we get to the adrenal medulla, here in a second, there we go. So the adrenal medulla, again, in this case, so it's part of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So it can be viewed as nervous tissue, is one of the ways that it's sometimes described. So you're going to see the release of both epinephrine, norepinephrine. Epinephrine is more colloquially known as adrenaline. You also see epinephrine if somebody has an allergic reaction and they need an EpiPen. That's epinephrine. And so, for example, if somebody has a reaction to, let's say they're allergic to peanuts and their airways start to close up, if you give them an injection of epinephrine, that can rescue them, because one of the things that epinephrine does is causes bronchodilation. So it causes a relaxation of the smooth muscle around the airways, and so it opens their airways back up so they can breathe again. From a fight or flight standpoint, that would be advantageous, because if we're getting ready to have to run from something, then we're going to need lots of oxygen. So we want to relax the muscles around the bronchioles so that we can get more air into the lungs, so we can diffuse more oxygen into the bloodstream, so we can produce more ATP. So that's one of the effects of epinephrine, but it also increases fat breakdown. So again, lipolysis increases the breakdown of glycogen, particularly in the liver. So again, we're trying to free up fuel stores so that we have the energy that we need in order to engage in fight or flight. Norepinephrine is a pretty powerful peripheral vasoconstrictor, so causes your blood vessels to close down. And so what that does is it directs blood flow away from where it's not needed. So it directs blood flow away from muscles that we're not using right now, directs blood flow also away from like the kidneys, the liver, the intestines, etc. And it's then, we'll talk about this more when we get to the cardiovascular chapter, the circulatory chapter, but effectively then once, let's say if you're running, the muscle cells that are in the legs are going to produce lots of carbon dioxide. They're going to be acidic. And so in response to those local metabolites, you're going to get local vasodilation, or the blood vessels are going to open up to the working muscles. So effectively, norepinephrine kind of closes down all the blood vessels. And then once the working muscles start to produce some of the byproducts of exercise, then those blood vessels that directly supply the working musculature open back up. And so that's how we direct blood flow to where it's needed. We kind of close it down throughout the system, except obviously to the brain and heart. But throughout the rest of the system, we basically close it down, and then we open it up in the working muscles so that we can direct blood flow to where it's needed. So norepinephrine plays a pretty important role in maintaining blood pressure. So you can see here in terms of short-term stress, so if we are running from a fire, as this guy is, so we're going to release hormones from the adrenal gland. So we're going to release both epinephrine, norepinephrine, and so the effect there, so those have cardiovascular effects. They're going to increase heart rate. They're going to increase contractility of the heart. It's going to beat harder. So that then increases blood pressure, causes epinephrine, as we talked about, causes bronchodilation, and then not all of them, but in particular, epinephrine and cortisol are going to free up energy. So they're going to cause the breakdown of glycogen in the liver, so they'll increase blood glucose. You're going to get an increased breakdown in muscle tissue and in fat, so that we can either make new glucose out of the we can make new glucose out of the protein, and then we free up fat so that muscle cells can use that as well. So basically, we're trying to free up energy so that we can engage in exercise. So all of those are useful short-term responses. Where it becomes bad is if those things occur over the long term. So if you have long-term stress because you're stressed out by life circumstances, whether that be that we're all stuck in our houses for potentially a long time, or that you are stressed out about lack of money or any other sort of life stressors, the body basically sees that as something that's a physical danger to you. So that triggers then that fight or flight response. So then that triggers the release of cortisol. That triggers the release of aldosterone. So remember that aldosterone causes us to hang on to sodium so that we can keep our blood pressure up. Because if we're going to exercise, well, I need that sodium. I need as much fluid as I can hang on to, so that the heart can pump more efficiently. So keeping that sodium is really useful. But if you do that all the time, then that's going to cause an elevation in blood pressure, basically because you're hanging on to too much fluid. So the constant release of aldosterone then increases blood pressure, which then overloads the heart. So those long-term stresses can be bad for the heart, in part because of an increase in blood volume. Similarly, the release of cortisol constantly, because again, you're constantly under stress, you're going to get that constant release of blood glucose, then can play a role in diabetes. Again, we're going to have high levels of plasma free fatty acids because of that breakdown, that constant lipolysis. We're constantly breaking down muscle, so you're going to see a reduction in muscle mass, and then again you're going to see a reduction in bone formation, or at least a reduction in the repair of the bones, and a reduction in cartilage formation, or at least a reduction in the repair. So then those long-term stresses then can contribute to poor health, because you're going to see increase in blood pressure, increase in blood glucose, which can then predispose you to diabetes, reduction in muscle mass, which then decreases your basal metabolic rate, which then again is going to play a role contributing to diabetes, contribute to weight gain, those kinds of things. So the long-term stresses then become problematic because they lead to all of those adverse effects. That's one of the ways that those long-term stresses can lead to things like heart disease or diabetes. All right, so our last one is the pancreas. And so the pancreas is going to secrete, so the pancreas is one of the organs. In the very first slide, it talks about that some organs are both endocrine and exocrine glands. So the pancreas is one of those. So the pancreas is an exocrine gland in that it's going to release pancreatic juice, which helps us digest fats. It's going to secrete that into the small intestine. So that's its exocrine function. But from an endocrine standpoint, it releases insulin and glucagon. And so one of the ways that this book describes it, I think is pretty good, is that the cells of the pancreas, your alpha and beta cells, are, quote, tiny fuel sensors, end quote. So that's a good way of putting that. And so effectively what they do is if the blood glucose gets too low, then the alpha cells are going to release glucagon. And so glucagon is going to stimulate the liver to break down its stores of glycogen and kick that glucose back into the bloodstream to get our blood sugar back within normal limits. So you do that after a prolonged period of fasting, for example. So, first thing in the morning, if you go, you haven't eaten in 10 hours or something like that, that breakdown of liver glycogen is what's keeping your blood glucose up so the brain has the fuel stores that it needs. And so, again, one of the things you see too in terms of exercise advice is that exercising fasted causes muscle breakdown, because certainly it does. And so you'll also get some cortisol release, as mentioned with that. And so, again, part of the rationale for that cortisol release, or part of the reason the body does that and breaks down muscle, is so in case your liver glycogen stores are depleted, you can use the proteins from that muscle to make new glucose, which again is called gluconeogenesis, to help keep your blood glucose stores up. So glucagon, the thing to know about it causes the breakdown of liver glycogen. It's going to elevate blood glucose. Insulin is the opposite. So insulin is secreted after a meal when blood glucose increases, and so it's going to stimulate in particular muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, and fat cells to take that glucose out of the blood, and then in the case of fat cells, convert it to triglycerides, or in the case of muscle cells, will cause it to be stored as glycogen, or you can break it down and convert it into lactate, and the liver can actually reformulate that lactate into glucose, and then that can help restore liver glycogen as well. So the short thing to know about insulin, it causes blood glucose to decrease, causes muscle cells and fat cells in particular to pull glucose out of the blood and to store them. And so obviously then both of those work on that negative feedback loop. So if your blood sugar is too high, you're going to release insulin. You'll pull glucose out of the blood into the muscles, the liver, and the fat cells. And then once glucose comes back down within normal limits, you'll stop secreting insulin. And so now you're all set. And obviously glucagon works the opposite direction. Last thing in terms of diabetes. So diabetes there's two types, as you're aware. So in the case of type 1, that's typically an autoimmune disorder. So the individual's own immune cells can attack their pancreas and inhibit their ability to produce insulin. And so if you can't produce insulin, you can't get blood sugar down. So you have to oftentimes, or probably always, take supplemental insulin in order to get that glucose out of the bloodstream to keep blood sugar within normal limits. In the case of type 2 diabetes, that is the one that we associate with obesity and inactivity. And so effectively, kind of the way I like to think about it is if sometimes you see people at Quick Trip or other convenience stores, people have like just big jugs that they'll fill up with, Mountain Dew or Coke or whatever. And if you sit there and if you sip that throughout the day, you're getting this constant influx of glucose. And so in response to that constant influx, the body is constantly secreting insulin to try to pull that glucose out of the blood and keep your blood sugar from being elevated for too long. But if the muscle cells in particular are constantly, and fat cells, if they're constantly exposed to insulin, they become less responsive to it, and that's your insulin resistance. So that may or may not be related to a downregulation in the number of receptors. Again, it's probably more likely related to that a defect or a change in the secondary messenger system. So when the insulin receptor receives the insulin, it doesn't cause it to signal to the insulin transporter to actually move to the cell membrane and pull that out of the blood. So type 2 we associate with insulin resistance. And you can see the symptoms there. So the first one is polyuria, which is a huge urine output. And so effectively what happens there is that excess glucose in the blood pulls in fluid. So pulls fluid out of the cells and into the blood. And then as that glucose enters the kidney tubules, it has the same effect. And so as glucose moves into the kidney tubules, it pulls fluid with it, and then that causes the increased production of urine. And so because of that, you get dehydration. That dehydration produces excessive thirst, which is the polydipsia. So again, because of the dehydration, you get really thirsty. And then the last thing on there is polyphagia, which is excessive hunger, because effectively what happens is even though you've got all of this glucose in the blood, you're not able to transport it inside of the cells. And so the cells, even though there's plenty of fuel available, if you can't get it inside of the cells, now you can't break it down, so those cells can't make ATP. So they have to do something else. So one of the things that they often do is to break down fat, and you'll see the production of ketone bodies. And so then you get ketone bodies are slightly acidic, and then you can get ketoacidosis, where the blood gets too acidic. And so you see this response where the person is going to hyperventilate a little bit to try to blow off, or not a little bit, they're going to hyperventilate to try to blow off the carbon dioxide that's produced as a result of that. But so the most common symptoms that people notice when they report is that they urinate all the time and that they are thirsty all the time. So those two symptoms oftentimes are triggers for people whenever we're considering whether or not they might be diabetic. And that's it. So that's all the new material for test 2. So good luck on that. Hope you all do well. And I will talk to you again when we get to the lungs.